start, now that we've kind of gone over an introduction, we're just starting by examining exam day. And basically what we're going to do is look at three primary things about exam day. First of all, your scores on each portion of the exam and your overall score, how many times you've taken the exam, and if anything unusual happened that might have artificially lowered your score. I'll be focusing mostly on the uniform bar exam because the vast majority of our listeners are uniform bar exam takers, but I'll also point out some other state bar exam specifics. We link to a lot of state bar exam data too if you've downloaded this PDF. So basically why we're starting here is because this tells us how much work you need to do and how much you need to change your approach. For example, if you miss the bar exam by a lot on your fifth try, you need to do more work than someone who's 2 points away on their first try taking the exam. So that's why we start by looking at exam day. Some bar exam takers don't realize how close they are to passing, and others don't realize how far they are from passing. But thankfully, your score report should have a decent amount of data to help you determine this. So let's just start by looking at your MBE score. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about percentiles because this will help you also when you're examining your essay score, particularly if you're in a uniform bar exam jurisdiction. Note that some jurisdictions will tell you your percentile. For example, New York and Washington, they're going to tell you your percentile for each MBE subject as well as your overall MBE percentile, which is very helpful. If your state does that, you can almost kind of ignore this, besides the fact that you might want to, just be aware of it generally, because that's the percentile you want to use. If your state doesn't tell you your percentile, and most states don't, then what you want to do is look at your MBE score. The state will not give you your raw score, but they'll give you a converted MBE score. So find whatever that score is and look at the top of this chart. And you can see there's MBE scores ranging from 180 down to 95. And basically what you want to do is find your score or whatever is close to your score on this chart, and then look at the percentile below it. And the percentiles range from 99th percentile, which is the highest, to the first percentile, which is the lowest. One thing you want to note is that, let's say you got a 105 on the MBE, that's only third percentile. So that means that you scored higher than 3% of people taking the MBE, so you have a lot of work to do. And by the way, this data is based on February 2018 data, so they haven't actually really released data like this recently. So we're working off of older data, but it still is pretty close to probably what you'll see. It hasn't changed significantly. The bar exam is still a curve. If you take a July bar exam, the curve is a little bit different than the February bar, but this should give you a general idea of about where you are. So if you scored a 105, you're in the third percentile, meaning you scored higher than 3% of examinees taking the bar exam. That means you have a lot of work to do because technically you're going to want to raise your score up somewhere between a 130 and a 144, all right? Basically, if you're in California, then you're going to want that 144. That's the highest MBE score. So you're going to want to raise that score up to between 45th percentile and probably about 80th percentile, depending on your jurisdiction. So that means you have a lot of work to do if you're in a very low percentile. And again, it's because the bar exam is graded on a bell-shaped curve. So, as you kind of get toward the middle of that curve, it's harder to increase your percentile as much. How do you know what score you actually need to pass the bar exam? The vast majority of states don't require a minimum MBE score. So it doesn't really matter. Like if you're in New York, they don't care how you get that 266, all right, to pass the bar exam. You could get a 130 on the MBE and a 136 on the essay portion and you'll pass. But for your purposes, if you're trying to figure out about what score you need to pass, if you're in New York, you would take that 266 and divide it by 2. So you want about a 133, which is somewhere between 45th and 60th percentile. If you're in a jurisdiction that requires a 260, you want about a 130. If your jurisdiction requires a 280, you want to score about a 140 on the MBE. Again, you don't need to, but that would be considered passing for your purposes while you're looking at your score report. So this tells you about how much work you need to do, so it's good to figure out what your MBE percentile is and how far you are from passing. You can do the same exact thing with your essay score. Okay, figure out what your essay score is and what percentile you are in, and that'll tell you how far you are from passing. At the bottom of the page, you can see that most states grade essays or MEEs on a scale of 1 to 6. A 3.9 to a 4.2 is considered passing, okay, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. If you score about a 4, that should be pretty good. That's passing in UBE jurisdictions that require a 266 to pass. Okay, and we have a little bit more information there. If you're in California, you're going to have 5 essays and a performance test. Usually they say about a 65 is passing on the California essay exam. If you're in Michigan, a 135 is passing. And if you score about a 7, that's what they say is passing. In reality, it's a little lower. It's usually about a 6.5 or 6.8 or something, just depending on the curve that Michigan decides to use. But that should give you an idea about how you're scoring. So you can fill in the worksheet and state how you've scored on each MEE if you're in a uniform bar exam jurisdiction, and figure out your average MEE score. This will, again, tell you how far you are from passing. We find that a lot of people just assume that they had trouble with the MBE and they assume they did great on the essay portion, when in reality, that doesn't always happen. In reality, a lot of times people do about the same, or they'll even score worse on the essay portion. People just assume it's the MBE because they don't feel as good about that portion. The good news is it's often easier for examinees to improve their essay score than it is to improve their MBE score. And again, you don't need a minimum MBE score to pass the bar exam in the vast majority of states, including uniform bar exam states. Okay, next let's look at the MPT. The grading scale is about the same. I would look at your MPT scores, add them up, divide them by 2, figure out how you're scoring on the MPT. A lot of students don't score very high on the MPT, and so this is usually a place where students have some work to do. Lastly, look at your overall uniform bar exam score. Most states don't release this data, so if you're not in a uniform bar exam state, this is going to be less helpful. But if you are in a uniform bar exam state, this will tell you about how you scored. So you can look at the top numbers, your total score, and the percentiles below, and it'll just give you an idea of how much work you have to do. So ask yourself the following questions. In general, how did I score? Was I far below passing? A 150 to a 230. If your state's on a 200-point scale, for example, like Michigan, I would say this is like a 115 or below. If you're pretty far from passing, this might indicate that you might need to significantly change your approach. Do course, tutoring, take time off work, whatever. Or are you just below passing, 10 points or more below, like a score of 240 to 250. And if you're on a 200-point scale in your state, it would be like a score of 120 to 125. This means, you're below passing, you're not super far below passing though. Are you a little below passing, 5 to 10 points below? A 200-point scale would be about a 125 to a 130. Or are you very close to passing, like just a point or a few points away? This would mean that your approach to the bar exam can be, you don't have to change it drastically and you can probably still pass. But you do want to take it seriously. You don't want to be one of those people that takes the bar exam 10 times and you're within, 5 points of passing each time. So I always recommend that even if you're close to passing, you pretend that you want to increase your score significantly just to maximize your chances of passing it. Ask if your score was significantly lower on one portion of the exam. This might tell you where you really have to work. The MBE, the essays, the MPT, or was everything about the same? Ask how many times you've taken the bar exam. Because again, if you're on your 5th time or your 10th time, then you want to change your approach more significantly than if you're on your very first time taking the bar, where a less drastic change might be needed. And I'm not trying to be mean to anybody, I'm just being honest. I don't want you to waste your time, spending years taking the bar exam. So find a new approach, even if it's not with us, find a new approach if you need a new approach to pass the bar exam. All right, if I am a repeat taker, have I seen significant improvement between exams? This is going to vary based on your overall score, but has it improved over time? Pretty significantly, at least 10 points, hopefully even 10 percentile points. If you haven't seen significant improvement, then you really have to consider varying your approach. All right, so again, what does this all mean? If this is your first exam, it might be easier to change your approach and significantly raise your score. But don't become complacent. Put in the work. Pretend you have to raise your score significantly, even if you do not. If you've taken the bar exam more than once, then you want to look for an improvement in your score, something significant. If you haven't seen significant improvement and you've tried it more than once on your own, you should consider, a pretty drastic change to your approach if you're serious about passing, like a new course, tutoring, time off. We just helped a fifth time taker who, didn't even go to law school. She scored about a 210 on her first bar exam. And again, she didn't go to law school. And she passed with a 284 on a uniform bar exam. So she passed in basically every single jurisdiction. And we told her you need to make a major change and you need to follow a pretty, grueling study plan. And she did it. We were just being honest with her because we didn't want her to spend more time taking the bar exam and putting off her career. So she ended up passing the bar exam. And she was very happy. So just something to keep in mind, that sometimes you just need to change your approach pretty significantly to pass the bar exam. The very last thing to look at is if anything unusual happened that might have affected your score. This only really affects about, I would say, 5% of people that we talk to. Most people don't have anything really unusual that happens, but sometimes there is something that will make your score artificially low, and it doesn't really reflect what you know. For example, major timing issues, major anxiety issues during the exam, like blanking out or panicking, major sleep deprivation issues. Like we had a student who, she was a private student, so we tutored her, but she would stay up all night and she would meet her tutor at 8 in the morning before she went to bed. And then she'd sleep during the day, and so during the exam, she couldn't sleep at all at night, and this affected her performance. So she didn't sleep for 2 nights in a row. She still just barely passed, but she did pass. But it, caused a lot of anxiety after the bar exam. Was there a sickness or illness that affected performance? You had the flu, a personal or family emergency, or a major life issue or event. Ask yourself honestly if your performance was affected. Just because something happened doesn't mean your performance was affected. People are affected differently, so just be honest with yourself. And again, if something like this did affect your score, then your score report might not necessarily reflect what score you would get on a day where you didn't have something major like this occur. Okay, so keep this in mind. And what do the answer to these questions mean? Basically, you want to look at your overall score. You want to look at how many times you've taken the bar exam. And if anything happened that might have artificially lowered your score, then you want to come up with a plan kind of based on this information. And we're going to talk about this in step 2, which is examining your preparation. But pay attention to all of this when considering how drastically you want to change your approach so that you can maximize your chances of passing the bar exam. So next we'll talk about step 2.